Today's episode is with Jan Hertsens.
There's people that do compliance, like we have to do PCI compliance because that's the law, and if we don't, then they're shutting us down. And now we don't have any money, and then we're going to be homeless. A lot of this stuff was not properly managed and old systems, right? So if your OS is no longer supported, then you can try patching, but you're just going to get new vulnerabilities, right?
Correct.
Why? Oh, we have to decrypt the stuff. Okay, why? Why do you want to see that? What is it going to do? Like, well, it's compliance. Yeah, but why is it compliant? What is the higher level goal that you're trying to do instead of just checkboxing stuff? Having to deal with bad stuff happening in your environment, right? And I feel like if you're doing the job right in designing things properly, security comes sort of as part of the best practices, not just this.
Hi everyone, this is Purushottam, and thanks for tuning into Scale to Zero podcast. Today's episode is with Jan Hertsens. Jan is a senior security consultant at AWS. He has been active in technology for decades across various disciplines, from security and integration to name a few. He has worked in various roles as well, like developer, functional analyst, team leader, and consultant. And he also created X Cleaner in 2001, the first anti-spyware program at that time, and co-founded a company called X Block Systems in 2002, and served as its CTO. Jan, thank you so much for joining me in the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. For our audience, do you want to briefly share about your journey?
So how this all happened? The weird accent is Belgian. I started my career as a regular application developer, doing Oracle Form 6, for those old enough to remember that, and then worked at Capgemini Ernst & Young as a manager of what was then called the Internet Competency Center, where we had to work directly with customers and actually had to explain to them what the internet was and why it would be good to get on them. And it also involved everything from building the application to building the servers to doing the networking to securing everything. So there's lots of stories on the security of early web servers, which I will not get into today. And while I was doing that in the early 2000s, I accidentally started a company with a buddy of mine in Ohio, because we stumbled on a gap in the market in terms of anti-spyware. Anti-spouseware is what it was called then as well. So there were commercial keyloggers being sold to literally spy on people. So we built the solution on that. That was sort of started as a joke because the software said, oh, this is completely undetectable and unremovable. And I took that as a personal challenge. And we built a company that did that. And then I took a year sabbatical at Ernst & Young to go run the company in Ohio. And then one thing led to another, sold the company to another company in Silicon Valley. Did a couple of years there, moved around a little bit to another company, which was like a medium-sized startup where I was director of security, responsible for the sort of a software as a service call center company that did that. And then after that, I ended up at AWS as a security consultant, basically doing sort of the same thing as I was doing in the immediately off the books. A little bit is helping my buddies that were running startups, getting them secured. Now I'm doing it with more firepower behind me, and with less of a need for begging and screaming to get funding for security.
That's quite an interesting journey. So I'm curious, what does a day in your life look like nowadays?
So in terms of the role, so at AWS we have a professional service department whose role is to get our customers in the cloud. Underneath of that, you have various specialties like big data, IoT, database, etc. and the security specialty helps our customers move their more sensitive workloads. And the work with the customers can be very broad, from like sitting down with the CTO, discussing the PCI strategy for the next couple of years, to working with a developer to debug an S3 bucket policy, giving trainings or workshops, helping with pre-sales, hacking Python code. And when I'm not working with customers, I'm usually mentoring new colleagues or obsessing about some internal process improvements. There isn't really a typical day for me. Um, in the years before Armageddon, I was often flying out to visit customers in sort of interesting locations. I did projects from Honolulu to London, and I like soaking up the culture there. And
Hmm.
these days, I'm working mostly remotely, and most of the stuff is handled via video conference. And this greatly confuses my puppy because he always thinks that there's new people that might be. So yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, and especially you work with so many customers, so every day it's not the same team, right?
Mhm.
So for today, we are going to talk about like continuous security and incident response. So let's start. There is always a debate between security practitioners and experts when it comes to compliance and security. And at the same time, practitioners understand that you have to balance between both of them, like compliance requirements and continuous security. So can you help us understand what these mean when we say continuous security or compliance requirements, and how are they different from each other?
Yeah, so I split it up in basically three personas that I deal with, three types of people, all with their own agendas and drivers, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the people who are building apps who don't want to get pwned, right? So did not get pwned is their driver.
Mm-hmm.
There's people that do compliance, like we have to do PCI compliance because that's the law, and if we don't, then they'll shut us down. So, and then we don't have any money, and then we're going to be homeless. That's their driver. So they need to check some boxes, right? For good or
Mm-hmm.
bad, whether you like it or not, some boxes need to be checked, right? So that's their
Mm-hmm.
driver. And then there's the management team, which drives this stuff, and they have a more high level view of that. What typically happens is they get some product that says like, oh, run this on your system, and it'll tell you how many vulnerabilities you have, and they put it on a graph. And their job, their focus is make line go down, right? There's now so many vulnerabilities. There's 10,000 now. By the end of the month, I want it to 5,000 or whatever. Make line go
Right.
down, right? So
Right.
the not get pwned, check the box, and make line go down focuses. Um, and those are needed to be balanced, right? The last one is
Mm-hmm.
sort of kind of the easiest one, mostly because they have there's only one criteria there that you see,
Mm-hmm.
but combining it with the other ones, that's where the art is, and
Mm-hmm.
quite often they are um, in they're in conflict often. For example, I had a customer who they say their focus is on not getting pwned, but their
Mm-hmm.
main focus was literally on line go down. They were doing things like, hey, this vulnerability scanner said that we have 14,000 vulnerabilities on our EC2 instances. So they
Mm-hmm.
directed a whole bunch of people trying
Mm-hmm.
to fix those things. But they didn't realize a couple things, like some of those things were systems in autoscaling groups. Let you think about that. Why that is a little bit of silly, because the short answer is if the autoscaling goes up and down, then you have to repatch those 4,000 things. The other
Yeah.
problem is that they had was a lot of the stuff was um, not properly managed and old systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your OS is no longer supported, then you can try patching, but you're just going to get new vulnerabilities, right?
Correct.
So there's the triage process that needs to be
Mm-hmm.
done in there. that
Hmm.
wasn't being done, right? So you focus on line go down because you think you're securing it, but you're not, right? And then
Hmm.
on the other hand, you have things like, hey, oh, the developers have admin access in production and they have keys on their laptop. That's, in my book, a bigger problem than that, right? So,
So I guess
yeah.
what you're highlighting is the priority, right?
Mhm.
Each persona, the three personas that you highlighted, have different agendas, different priorities. Balancing them is the most important factor instead of just looking at one persona and driving the security program based on that,
Yes. And
right? So then, in that case, how do I find that balance? Like,
most indicative of success at customers in running these programs if they have a well supported center of excellence for their cloud security.
mm,
You can call it
mm,
different things, but that's sort of what I mean. A central location that understands what's going on and that manages it centrally and that sets the rules, right? Like,
mhm,
and that's something that you have to explain on the line go down, people, is that not all of these 20,000 vulnerabilities are equal to each other.
mhm,
It's not that you
mhm,
solved 1,400 of them that it's better than you solve these three of out there. So to me, running these scanners is like going to the doctor and getting getting an EMR scan or any sort of scan over your body, right? It'll say like, oh, well, you have ingrown toenails. Let's work. No, you also have possible liver cancer. Let's deal with that first, right? So
yeah.
so I just make that up. I'm not a real doctor. But those are the things you have to do the triage process first and drive policy
Mhm,
based off of that, right? It
mhm,
doesn't help like setting these things, doing the patching like crazy on a timesheet. You have to set up the policy first. Are we making those images properly? Who's making them?
mhm,
Like those high level things need to be done first. And quite often these processes get fired off because there's a problem, because there
mhm.
was an exploit, because they got pwned, right? And there's an immediate reaction. Fix everything right now without thinking like, let's cut the toenails first. Like, no, let's do the most important first stuff. Let's set the policy on you shouldn't be drinking that much tequila first. So those are the different things. That
Okay.
makes
So having that central governing body which looks at each persona and their agenda and then sets the priority
Yes,
would help the organization, if I
yes,
phrase it
and
correctly. Okay.
it's on them to also speak the different languages to the other people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
here's a report in nice primary colors, which has the graphs on it and stuff like that, and drive that, right? That's what I sometimes do, is like make that report, but also do it different than what the tools generate. Do it the report per team, right? Like this team versus that team, and now all of a sudden the manager knows how to manage. Right? Like, oh, that team is
Mm-hmm.
running behind. Like, I got to go yell at this dude, right? And then on the other hand, like the thing that I found out is like quite often those development teams, they're good at developing, but they're not necessarily very fluent in cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So what I try to do for them is to come up with easy how to's and
Mm-hmm.
baked stuff that they can say, here, this is how you make sure that your S3 bucket is encrypted. This is how you make sure that you apply a WAF. Here's the example of it. And here's a script that'll deploy it. Instead of just giving them the white paper and here, go figure it out. Like, they don't have time to like learn 14 new different concepts. They just want their product release because their manager is yelling at them, why are they late?
Right, right. So one of the things that you highlighted, which I really like, is the communication. Right,
Mhm.
while working with different personas, you have to tailor your message accordingly. You cannot have like one size fits all communication for all of them. So when it comes to cloud, you have to incorporate both those strategies, right? Like from a compliance perspective, also from a practical security implementations, and often the organizations follow based on some compliance regulations. It could be driven by data residency requirements or sales goals or any certification that you need to attain. So how do they differ from like practical or continuous security implementations?
I'll have to do a quote here, right, from one of
Sure.
my favorite philosophers. Says, "I fear not the man who practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man
Hmm.
who practiced one kicks 10,000 times." And that was Bruce Lee saying that. And I
Hmm.
feel like a lot of these implementations try to do everything all at once without
Hmm.
really focusing on a particular thing, on doing the basics right, like doing the basics of like networking and IEM and etc. Right. Those are the things where it quite often um, goes wrong in my opinion. You have
Okay.
it's important. The compliance requirements are important. That's one of the things that I always ask when I go somewhere, is like, okay, what are your requirements, right? Do you have PCI? Do you have HIPAA? Do you have whatever, right? Let's put it on the board. Like, these are the things that do you have an internal program.
Hmm.
And then the thing that people usually don't do is asking why we want to have this, right? Oh, we need a Palo Alto. Why? Because we want to inspect the stuff. Why? Oh, we have to decrypt the stuff. Okay, why? Why do you want to see that? What is it going to do? Like, well, it's compliance. Yeah, but why is it compliant? What is the higher level goal that you're trying to do instead of just checkboxing stuff?
Hmm.
And that quite often gets forgotten, especially in a migration to the cloud. Like, these things don't make sense there. Um, and I always tell these things, like, tell customers, these things are not the Bible, right? They're not always good for your particular organization. We
Hmm.
often see disconnects. Like, practical example, CIS. CIS is a great industry standard. It's referenced all over the time, right? Now,
Hmm.
have you ever tried applying the CIS recommended hardening guide on a machine and then put production software on it that still works?
Hmm.
That I've never seen it not take several months and
Hmm.
lots of blood, sweat, and frustration taken out, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for not always the best return on effort is what I'm saying. Other
Yeah.
example, AWS CIS says one of the rules is that you have to have a CloudWatch alert that fires an SNS topic that sends out an email every time there's a security group's change.
Hmm.
Hold on. That means, like, whenever somebody releases anything or make any change at all, you're firing off emails. To
Hmm.
who? Oh, we don't know. Like, and then usually some manager and then or security guy. And, like, one of the things I ask him is, how many unread emails do you have right now in your inbox? Just tell me the number of digits. Is it 3 digits, 4 digits of unread emails that you have? Do you think getting more emails is going to be part of the solution or the problem?
Yeah. It's just more noise and more spam,
Yes,
right?
it's,
And
it's like,
when the volume goes up, you start ignoring them right
and,
away.
and these are just opinions, right? That quite
Hmm.
often don't match what is going on in the real world in 24. Right?
Yeah.
Like, in
Yeah.
24, you do not alert via email because that's just stupid, right? You have, like, a central SIM, you have an expensive Splunk, you have a Slack message that goes in there that manages that, but you do not send email because that's not going to fly, and it's also not going to fly whenever the minute changes happens, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
one of the other things that we were talking about also was also the conflict between the requirements for compliance and security. Like, one
Hmm.
of the one of the examples is, um, it's mandatory to have multi-factor authentication on the root account for
Hmm.
an AWS account. It's mandatory to rotate the password.
Password. Yeah.
Yes, that sounds good, but what I actually recommend my customers is to when they're using like API based creation of AWS accounts. So we're not creating the root account at all, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if it doesn't exist, it can get
How will you?
right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and then you find, oh, we have a finding here that we have to fix. We have to rotate the account, so we have to create the account. Are you helping? So
You're creating more problems for yourself in a way,
yes,
right?
that's what I'm saying is like you should not do this un unthinkingly, and that's a lot of people do that. Like they try to like, oh, we have to be compliant. The auditor is going to come in 2 months. We have to get through this, come hell or high water, and that does not always go through. Again, there's the high level triage that makes sense. Like you can tell the customer, you can tell them, the auditor, this is a compensating control for that, right? It all
Right,
depends on where
right.
you want to put your prioritization on that.
And I have seen often that the auditors are not looking for a direct match with the controls, right?
Mhm,
They are trying to see that if you have enough security controls in place to match with what, let's say, CIS or PCI has defined as a requirement.
mhm,
uh, and as long as you sort of can cater to it with some related security controls or something like that, as you were highlighting, then that should be good enough. Another thing that you highlighted, which I really liked, is why, like asking that question, right? Often on a day-to-day basis we are like, yeah, whatever was told me that I need to implement MFA for root account, if it doesn't exist, let me create and then enable root account MFA, right? Instead, if you ask why and try to get to the bottom of it, maybe you don't have to create that root account and you increase work for yourself, right?
mhm.
So your role has evolved throughout your career from director of security, now Gen AI lead. How do you approach this? Do you approach it in the same way, or do you approach it differently, like balancing between compliance requirements and the continuous security implementation?
So Gen AI is very sexy and very hip now, right? You can't say anything without, you can't even buy a toothbrush without Gen AI in it these days.
Hmm.
Um, and there's a lot of people jumping in on that. I'm a very down to earth guy.
Hmm.
When it there's a lot of people talking about securing like the Gen AI stuff. In my book, again, do the practice the standard kick first and do the securing of your data properly as you've done before, right? 99% of the stuff in securing like your Gen AI instance is the same as doing a regular application or an SAP or whatever. You make sure that your data is encrypted. You make sure that you have access control. You make sure that you have your networking set correctly. That you use minimal privilege and stuff like that. It doesn't matter if you do those basic things right. Then you're already 99% of the time there, right? In terms of like Gen AI specific um, Gen AI specific securing, right? There's a couple different things that customers need to have in mind. Um, I'm personally one of those people that pragmatically don't don't trust the model, right? Don't trust the model with critical stuff. If don't
Hmm.
give it stuff and then expect it to keep it secret, right? There's people who try to like make sure to apply rules inside the model on never to talk about something like that or never to. That gets very tricky pretty quickly.
Hmm.
I I like to make get it look at it as a black box where if it
Hmm.
doesn't have the input, it can't have the output. You still have to do your regular access control and your manage the personas that have access to it, authentication, authorization towards this thing. You still have to do the logging, etc.
Hmm.
But those are the basic stuff, right? You can get into very like optimizing the performance of that and applying various layers on the um, on which rag somebody has access to. But
Right.
I would use that. I would rather have the course security right now on that. Um, and then it still gives you a whole bunch of functionality that you don't have right now.
So now, since we're speaking about Gen AI, and you work with a lot of customers, right,
Mhm.
who are incorporating security into their cloud infrastructure, uh, what patterns have you seen? How are organizations leveraging Gen AI when it comes to compliance, or when it comes to security, or even like incident detection and response?
Mhm. So a couple different things that we that I talked to with my customer um,
Hmm.
in different levels of maturity. Right, we have the crawl, walk, run thing, and I'm calling. I'm not just doing Gen AI because that's hip these days. I'm doing regular AI, right? Because Gen AI is just a subcategory of AI, which is a subcategory of machine learning that we've done for the past, and it's all one big blob. And so I would say start off with like managed services that have the AI or the ML inside there. Something like GuardDuty, for example, which can detect not normal behavior of customers.
Anomalies,
Right.
right?
There's systems that we have that will do fraud detection and things like that that all run in the background. It's a very
Hmm.
easy system that you can deploy. And then
Hmm.
as you go up the stack, you can do things like, hey, all of our security findings, let's stick them in a security lake, and let's use some visualization tools, and then let's use Q so that we can ask questions to the data, like what
Right, right.
stuff like that. That has been very practical. We've been doing things like Queue for Business, where basically the
Hmm.
cool part is you can dump a whole bunch of files in a bucket or in a database or whatever, give it access to, and then ask questions for it, which gives you a lot of benefits on that.
Hmm.
Another cool thing that I've been working on that is not officially released yet um, is automatic remediation of findings.
Wow.
So where it looks at like how you have these findings in there, creates a summary of that, but also like generates code to
Hmm.
um, to remediate.
Remediate
Yes.
the finding. Okay.
And that's sort of a fun thing that I happen. Again, I'm I'm always my job is to be paranoid, so I'm I keep my LLM on a short leash, right? It's like you can use it. I use it a lot for like code development and code generation,
Hmm.
which I also
Hmm.
included in there. But I see it sort of as sort of like a weird intern that's pretty fast, knows a lot, but does that sometimes, right? So you don't 100% trust them, trust but verify in these things, right? So we build
Yeah.
systems. For example, you have this sort of a finding. Okay, let's so we know what the detection is, right? We know what the finding is like. Your bucket is not encrypted, right? Okay, let's generate
Hmm.
some test cases, a positive and negative test case, and that is say, oh, create me IAC code that generates a compliant bucket, create and another one that creates a non-compliant bucket, right? And we can test that
Right.
automatically, right? Because on the first it should pass, and the other one it should fail, right? The same test. So we can
Correct.
programmatically
Yeah.
test that with known code, right? Now
Hmm.
I ask it to generate remediation code, right? And I then again run that against the positive and the negative one, see what happens, and it either fixes it or it doesn't fix it. And that's where you can like automate the validation of your code to like
Right.
95% already. So it's sort of cool stuff
Right.
that you can do there. That's very helpful in my opinion.
I like how you structured it, right? Like for organizations who want to, let's say, get into Gen AI for security and all, start with managed offerings. Don't just start building a new model and all. Rather, start with something off the shelf, and then maybe use RAG approach to feed more context. And if that doesn't serve your purpose, once you
And
validate
then
that,
you can, yeah,
maybe at that moment you can.
you can build your own models. We have tooling to do that. That's a little bit
Right.
more propeller hat to keep it going well, but then you have your own models that can be very highly focused on that particular thing, and then you can build that exactly as how you want it. Um,
Right. Right.
but yeah, I'm a big fan of always using the simplest solution to a particular problem. And if somebody else already has done it, then it's easier to just buy it or use it.
And that makes sense, right? Often most of the technology is simple, but we make it complicated in our heads, right? Or we try to go for the most complicated solution. So yeah, keeping it simple makes the most sense. One of the things that I want to learn from you is you work with many customers, and you must have been part of many war rooms or war stories that you might have heard around incident response in the cloud. So before we talk about some of these stories, can you tell our audience what incident response means to you?
So incident response, cloud or not, just means having to deal with bad stuff happening in your environment,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Okay.
and it's usually cut up in a couple different pieces. You have the preparation for it. You got to be ready for it, and I'll talk about that later.
Hmm.
You have to identify what's going on, so you have to have something that
Hmm.
fires off the logging, etc. You have to um, rein it in. You have to limit what that particular thing can do. That can, and we'll talk about how that's different in the cloud versus on-prem. Then you have to remediate and fix it, and then afterwards your lessons learned from it. So you have to see like, hey, what happened, and why did it happen, and how can we fix it so that it doesn't happen in the future.
Hmm.
Um, so the interesting part of how that's different, how that can be different in the cloud, um, is um, you where you normally in an on-prem data center, if you have to isolate something, have to go literally run in and pull cables. You can do
Hmm.
this all API driven, and you can automate that. That's one of the biggest
Right.
benefits is like you can automate everything, so you have um, you're not staying on higher footing, but on equal footing with the attacker who's also running a script, right? So you can run the script to
Hmm.
fix things, and that's why I'm saying that the preparation is always the biggest part of it. Having like limitations on your limiting the blast zone, right? Is like you can easily
Hmm.
do micro segmentation in the cloud, which is way harder if you have regular hard firewalls that you have to deal with. But you can say this thing can only talk to where it comes. It can only get incoming connections from that load balancer, and it can only make outgoing connections to that particular database. And it can only the load balancer can only be accessed um, via a connection that comes from the WAF. So those things you
Hmm.
can pre-build pretty easily. And then the cool part about this, one of my favorite things is the idea of and with my excuses to the vegans, the cattle versus pets. Right. In the olden days,
Pets.
you
Yeah.
have one web server that lives forever, that you rub the right way, and that you make sure that doesn't thing happened. In the new way is like if something ever goes wrong, you shoot it in the head, and you drop it and you replace it. Right. That's also
Hmm.
literally what like the load balancer and the auto scaling group works. Right. So all of
Yeah.
these things, by the way, um, I feel like if you're doing the job right in designing things properly, security comes sort of as part of the best practices, not just these separate things because that's some weird geek needs. No, just having a secure and stable infrastructure is something that everybody wants, right? So being able to auto scale is cool. Being able to auto scale and have immutable instances, right? Where instead
Hmm.
of patching them and like having a scanner running on them or stuff like that, no, you make your image once and you make sure that it never can change, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
make it as hard as possible for these things to get there, right? Harden it up. Um, so that replacing it or like is just a question of like, hey, kill the instance and done. Or maybe we want to snapshot it
Yeah.
first, right? And automatically move that image to somewhere in our lab where it's secure and where we can do forensics on it. And then, I don't know, depending on what we want to do, we got to find out who it was and sue them, right? Um,
Yeah. So you highlighted network segmentation, and that's a very powerful uh, technique,
mhm,
right? That organizations can leverage to keep the minimize the blast radius. So we recorded an episode with Tom Adamski from AWS itself, and we spoke at length about network segmentation. So I'll suggest our audience also take a look at that episode so that they get an idea, right? And they can connect between what Jan is saying and how what Tom was saying and how they can be connected from an incident response perspective.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
so,
to, to jump on that, right? One of the things that
mhm,
I found that worked well is work with the application team, right? Instead of just the
mhm.
security
Yeah.
team. They always say, oh, well, the segmentation is part of the firewall, and the firewall is just the security guys, right? But the security guys don't really know what went on. For me, it works best if you make that part of the application delivery, right?
Mhm.
If you deliver an app, it should come with a an artifact that defines what this app does. It
Correct.
should run on Linux with this amount of RAM, and it should
Mhm.
connect to these databases, and it should listen on this port, and these processes should run, right? That is important information to know, and that's the application guy should be able to tell you, right? If they don't,
Right.
then they're effing up already there, and you have an issue there, right? It's
Yeah.
also
Yeah. Yeah.
important for any operational management, right? To say like, hey, how can I see if this box is healthy or not? So we need to know it in advance, right? We can also say like, hey, this box needs to access these URLs, right?
Mhm.
If
Mhm.
you make that part of the manifest of the application, then you can automate all those things without people needing to futz in firewalls or doing these things. And then you have very, very narrow segmentation that'll work. And
Mhm.
you can even put that same automation in QA environment so that when the application developers artifact is not 100% correct, it automatically fails there before it fails in production. And
Correct.
and now you know, like, hey, if this application all of a sudden goes to www.microsoft.com, which normally is no big deal if you see it on your network, but
Mhm.
that's not on the approved list. So now that is a big priority. One thing, like, why did this application made that request? And you can automatically kick off your incident response process on there. Like, either the application it did something wrong, or the definition is wrong, or we just got hacked. Right? You immediately know
Yeah.
that something is wrong, and then you could say like, hey, my remediation. You can automate that, and you can say, let's roll back to the previous version. that
Mhm.
that all with a zero downtime solution, if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. One of the key things that I got from your response is speaking with the application developers, right?
Mhm.
Ultimately, all of us are trying to deploy something to the cloud. So, like when I say all of us, like it's the developers, right, who are building the application which will be deployed in the production systems. So, speaking with them, you get that clarity that what exactly are the resources needed, how do they communicate with each other, how are those communications secure. So, the sooner you catch them, the better it is rather than doing it in a production system, live production
Mhm. Yeah,
system where
and
it
you speak
it
their
becomes a nightmare
language,
for
right?
you anyway.
You speak their language, like, and
Exactly.
things like what kind of data
Exactly.
is on there. Is that from there you can then tell like,
Hmm.
oh, this is highly secure data or whatever, and then like, oh, now we can use that to define our PCI scope or whatever it is, or for our HIPAA compliance. That one does PHI or stuff like that.
Right. Right. So we spoke about two things, right? Incident response, and we also spoke about touched on Gen AI.
Mhm.
So now, if I want to marry them together with Gen AI, what type of new attacks that you are noticing, which needs an incident response plan? Do
So
you
there's
see?
always you hear about that, like, oh, ChatGPT jailbreak or whatever. You can get it to say dirty words or data that it shouldn't. Right? That's where and we
Mhm.
see that a lot. I personally um, don't. I try to attack that on an earlier thing, right? On an earlier level. I said, don't give
Mm-hmm.
the data, right? So that the worst thing that could happen is
Mm-hmm.
it says a dirty word where to somebody who was asking for it, right? And stuff like that, or
Mm-hmm.
it gives you wrong information, right? So I see it as like an output validation, right? There's various techniques that you could
Okay.
do depending on what
Mm-hmm.
your use case is. If it's like an internal system, like where you'd say like before, like we want to do something that searches best practices and then that searches all our wikis and stuff like that. If somebody gets to search something, then we assume that they already have access to it, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
I actually know a big company that did exactly that, um, where they put all the wikis and stuff like that in the database in a
Mm-hmm.
rag, and then people could
Mm-hmm.
search it, and it worked well, right? So somebody asked like, "What are the secret projects that are not listed?" Right, and like, "Oh, here's an alphabetical list of all the secret projects." That, that was technically internal product, but they didn't think about that.
Mm-hmm.
That particular dimension of access that they did there. So
Right.
that
So that is one side of the coin. If I flip to the other side, how can tools like Gen AI be used to sort of defend from some of these
mhm.
attacks
So
or remediate even?
yeah, so what I did before, what I talked about before is like um, helping the people understand for protection, helping the people understand what the requirements are, how things work, right? So you can do sort
Mm-hmm.
of do like summaries of the project, like how do I being able from a development point of view, right? If you shift it all the way left, right? How do I securely create a new bucket in company XYZ that I'm working at, right? Being able to just
Mm-hmm.
ask you or and type it in and say, oh, here's an example code that you do, right? So that already is a win, right? Or having it
Mm-hmm.
integrated in your IDE is already a big win for that, right? So there's that level,
Right.
very very much left,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's the help in an analyzing big amounts of data that you found, like looking for patterns and that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's where both classical ML, like pattern analysis, and GenAI can work together in like find the low level patterns versus finding the high level patterns and being able to consolidate it and try to figure out what do things do it. Like what detective
Okay.
is trying to do is like build the graph of what's
Yeah.
going on. So these tools are there. Then there's the custom queries that you can build on side your data lake, and then
Mm-hmm.
stuff like what I was trying to do is like having an automation kick off, like, hey, propose me some code to fix this particular thing, right? I still wouldn't trust it to like do it immediately, but I would use it to um, help the incident responder as sort of like an assistant, right? Like, oh,
Right. Right.
or like they came in. Oh, it says that they came into that port. Okay, automatically. Oh, by the way, here's a NACL rule. Here's an AWS CLI command that adds a NACL rule that blocks that particular port right now. Okay,
Right.
I just
Right.
generated that for you. Like, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that looks good. Let's copy paste that, right? Or let's not do that, right? So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
decision, like, as sort of like the assistant towards the incident responder, right? Or like here's the
Mm-hmm.
code, right? Or basically what I've done is also I've brute forced it a little bit in like
Mm-hmm.
these are the expected problems that we have and things that we've had in the past, right? And these are probable findings that we could have. Generate me
Mm-hmm.
example resolutions for all of these in a loop, and then
Mm-hmm.
review those beforehand, right? It's like um, that I found very practical in um, doing the thinking before the screaming starts.
I like how you said, right? You use it as an assistant, which is helping you, giving you pointers rather than using it as a solution. Like when you get pointers, validate it and then maybe use it. The example that you gave, right? Maybe there is an ACL rule which can be implemented to block traffic. So validate it and apply it. So that way you are sort of using that for your incident response programs in a much better or faster way.
Yeah, and that's also the important part about incident response. You have to test it. You have to train it, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
As the philosopher Mike Tyson says, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Um, so
True.
you have to do
True.
all these plannings beforehand and know what's going on. Maybe run some simulations. Like, oh, let's imagine that we got pwned, right? What are we going to do? How what would we do, right? There's also some of the workshops that I run is like go through a simulation, and every single
Hmm.
time we would like find the customer would find new things that they didn't think about, right? Oh,
Hmm.
let's say that the website that the DNS was down or that the website was hacked. I'm like, okay, what would you do? Oh, maybe the next action is let's put up a standard web page that says that we're down. Okay, but can we present that? Oh, technically we need marketing approval for that. Oh, does anybody know how to contact that marketing? No. Oh, well, maybe we should put that in the plan. Or these stupid. Does anybody know whether this has legal implications or not? Oh, maybe we should review that with legal first before like. Oh yeah, let's do that. Let's write that on the sub. So just doing these, even a tabletop exercise, right,
Yeah, exactly.
can get you a lot of stuff. And then yeah, there's always the hands-on stuff. I love doing the AWS jams. I don't know if
Hmm.
you've known it. It's sort of for people who um, who don't know. It's sort of like DEF CON Capture the Flag without the horrible music. Um, where you try to where you have a real live environment and you have to go fix something like, hey, this bucket is open or this WAF rule is missed. We're going to go and fix it. And every single time people do that, um, they they learn something. And
Hmm.
what I love is the meta learning, because I tell them to go in groups of like 4 people, and then
Hmm.
there's a strategize. Do I do 4 incident responders, or do I do like an ops guy, a network guy, an application guy, and stuff like that? And sort of like building that team building on there is also very important
Exactly.
as a side
Exactly.
benefit that I noticed, which I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, it not only teaches you to uh, respond to incident, but also teamwork, right? How do you work together? Who is responsible for what? And then
How do we
sort of
communicate?
mimicking.
Stupid stuff like how do we communicate securely when there might be an attacker in our systems, right? Like
Exactly.
maybe I've seen places where the attacker had a 0 day in Active Directory, and the Active Directory was the SSO for all the other stuff. Like, how do you know who you're talking to?
Mhm.
Stupid stuff like, what's our backup plan on these things, right?
Right, right. Yeah, having without having a incident response plan would be like a chaos, right? You are trying to figure out things while there is an incident happening. So yeah, that's never recommended. Having something documented in place, and yeah, tabletop exercise is something that you highlighted, right? Is key also, because having something documented versus have done something like simulated it few times is very different, right? You have some muscle memory, so you know that
Yeah.
based on which response incident you go to which team and what next steps you need to take as well. So yeah, that's a very important points that you highlighted. Um, so that sort of brings us to the end of the security question section. Thanks, Jan, for the insightful conversation. Here are a few things that I gathered. The first one is for the compliance and security debate, understand different personas and their agendas. Have a governing body which works with all of these personas and helps with prioritization. Second one is always start with basic security practices and focus on one program at a time so that it doesn't get out of hand when it comes to implementing security practices or compliance controls. The last one is network segmentation plays a major role when it comes to incident response. It helps with reducing the blast radius. Thank you. So next section is focusing on security practices, like rating security practices. The way it works is I'll highlight a security practice and you need to rate from 1 to 5, 1 being the worst and 5 being the best. and you can add context why you
Mhm.
think why you gave a particular rating. So let's start with the first one. Conduct periodic security audits to identify vulnerabilities, threats, and weaknesses in your systems and applications.
So I would give that a solid 4. It's definitely something you need to do. Um,
Hmm.
you can improve on that by again shifting it left, doing your scanning and your vulnerability assessment before it goes to production instead of
Hmm.
afterwards.
Hmm.
But it's definitely a strong requirement there.
Makes sense. The second one is use strong passwords which contains uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, and also change it frequently.
I would give that a meager 3 because
Okay.
there's better stuff that you can do, right? People are horrible at this stuff. So I found that the best approach is to use SSO, but also to use things that cannot be phished, right? Currently, state of the art is like you have like a hardware key, right? Like
Hmm.
FIDO works perfectly with that. It
Something like this,
yeah, it works.
like a YubiKey.
Yeah, it costs like $20, and it's
Hmm.
amazing the number of things that can prevent it, right? Because people will be phished, right? People will click on email links, right? So it's like it's our job is don't. I hate it when they say like, hey, we should give training to people. We should tell them not to click suspicious links. What the heck is a suspicious link? And if you could tell me in a deterministic way what suspicious was, why the heck are you not blocking that email beforehand?
Exactly.
So you can ask, you can blame a user for doing the things you can't do. Same thing with passwords. I've had it in the same problem with where we had
Hmm.
the issue with the SSO being untrusty. We had to come up with a solution where literally people went to into the office and the security guards hand out YubiKeys after validating their um, have everybody come in and show their ID and show their badge, and then have the
Hmm.
security guard issue a thing, and so that got stuck into there as a workaround to get like because how else are you going to do that, right? If you can,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
AD got pwned, like AD got
Oh
pwned,
yeah.
that means that they had admin on the laptops as well. Yeah. Now what we so these things are better. So the strong passwords and the rotation. I find so that was why I give that a 3.
Makes sense.
I would instead of rotating it, I would do the new validation of actually checking it against pwned list, right? If the password has
Yeah, yeah.
already been used, then
Hmm.
you
Don't
can't
use
use it.
it. Use a new one.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Makes sense. The last one is develop and regularly test an incident response plan to help quickly detect, respond to, and recover from security incidents. Feels like we just spoke
We
about it.
spoke about
Yeah, how would you?
that would be a solid 5.
I agree with that. So yeah. So before we end the episode, I have one last question for you. Do you have any recommendation for our guests? Sorry, for our audience. It can be a blog or a book or a podcast or anything.
I thought about that, and I want to recommend a book that blew my mind several years ago. That's called Damon by Daniel Suarez, who's actually like a developer and also in security. I
Hmm.
love the fact it's a sci-fi book, but of 10 years ago. And instead of like phasers and Star Trekky stuff in there, it has things like AI,
Oh wow.
VR, um, global currency that is virtual, self-organizing groups of people, um,
Hmm.
wireless networking, driverless cars,
Oh wow.
3D
So
printing.
many
Like
areas.
like that's the sci. You see, that's the sci-fi stuff in there, right? So it's not like it doesn't exist yet. It's just the applications of that stuff. So that I found that
Hmm.
very interesting. It also has some societal implementation. So I'll drop you a link for those who are interested in that.
Thank you. And what we'll do is when we publish this episode, we'll also tag the book so that our audience can go there.
Alrighty.
So yeah, thank you so much, Jan, for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. It was lovely to speak with you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for watching. See you in the next episode. Thank you.